Price of eggs continue to soar as the bird flu cases wreak havoc on supplies in the U.S.
Yeah, in January, eggs cost about $6 a dozen, but today, a dozen eggs will cost you about $8.47.
The economy and to a troubling new forecast when it comes to the price of eggs, now predicted to rise more than 40% this year.
And egg prices are soaring in the United States and shelves are empty. A devastating bird flu outbreak continues to ravage poultry farms across the U.S.
Africa just delivered a massive shock to America's agricultural industry, and U.S. chicken farmers are feeling the pain. For decades, America flooded African markets with cheap poultry, making billions while local farmers struggled to survive. But everything has suddenly flipped. African nations are now banning more U.S. poultry imports, citing unfair prices, health concerns, and a growing push to protect their own farmers. And this time, Washington can't ignore it. Across the U.S., chicken farmers are sounding the alarm. Shipments are being rejected, contracts are collapsing, and export revenue is dropping fast. What used to be one of America's most reliable markets is now slipping away and fast. Meanwhile, African farmers are celebrating a new era of independence, finally taking back control of their own food supply. So why is Africa shutting its doors to U.S. poultry? Why are American farmers calling this a crisis? And what does this sudden shift mean for the global food market? The answer reveals a story of power, politics, and a shocking reversal America never saw coming. For decades, the United States enjoyed one of the most profitable and comfortable positions in the global food market, especially in the poultry industry. American chicken dominated shelves across the world, and Africa became one of Washington's most dependable markets. From frozen wings to mechanically deboned chicken parts, U.S. poultry was shipped by the millions of tons into African ports. It was cheap, it was available, and it became a major source of revenue for American farmers, so big that some farming states relied on Africa as a critical export destination. But today, that entire system is collapsing. Africa is slowly but steadily shutting its doors, issuing more bans, tightening import controls, and wiping billions off the American poultry export industry. What was once a guaranteed profit pipeline is now turning into a crisis, leaving U.S. chicken farmers scrambling for answers. 2. Understand the depth of this crisis. You have to understand how the U.S. poultry industry works. America produces more chicken than almost any country on Earth, and it consumes a lot of chicken domestically. But there is one problem. Americans prefer only certain parts. The breast meat and tenderloins are popular in restaurants and supermarkets, but other parts, backs, necks, feet, wings, thighs, don't sell as well in the U.S. These leftover dark meat cuts pile up in massive quantities. Instead of wasting them, American companies export them at extremely low prices to foreign markets. For years, Africa became the #1 dumping ground for this cheap chicken. It was a win-win for the United States. They made money selling the parts that American consumers didn't want, and African markets became dependent on U.S. poultry because it was far cheaper than African farmers could produce locally. But as cheap U.S. poultry flooded Africa, local farmers were unable to compete. African farms, already struggling with weak infrastructure, limited refrigeration, limited access to modern feed, and rising costs, found themselves drowned by a wave of extremely cheap U.S. frozen chicken. In many African countries, domestic production collapsed. Entire farming communities went bankrupt. Poultry feed factories shut down. The local chicken industry in multiple African nations nearly died. For Washington, this was simply trade. They sold chicken cheaply, and Africa bought it. But for African farmers and policymakers, it was unfair competition that destroyed local industries. It took years for African governments to realize just how deep the dependency had grown. Fast forward to today, and the script has flipped. African governments are now refusing to allow the collapse of their agricultural sector to continue. New bans, new restrictions, and new food safety regulations have been rolled out in multiple African countries. Some have banned U.S. poultry due to outbreaks of avian influenza. Others used health and safety concerns as a shield to protect local farms. Some simply said, we must build our own agriculture. America can't keep feeding us forever. These policy shifts are shaking the entire U.S. poultry export industry. American farmers, who once saw Africa as a permanent, guaranteed destination for their surplus chicken parts, are now waking up to a new reality. Africa is no longer dependent on the United States. And this is sending shockwaves through farming communities in states like Georgia, Arkansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Alabama, states whose economies rely heavily on poultry farming. Inside the United States, farmers are sounding the alarm. They say the numbers don't lie. Export volumes have fallen sharply in key African markets. For example, countries that once imported tens of thousands of tons of U.S. poultry annually are now cutting those numbers by half or even banning them entirely. Farmers say they are losing contracts that used to keep their operations afloat. They are seeing cold storage warehouses filled with unsold chicken parts. They are seeing prices dip, and they are seeing the frustration rise. Many American farmers feel betrayed not by Africa but by Washington. They believe that U.S. leaders never took Africa seriously as a growing agricultural market. They treated African countries like passive buyers, not as rising food powers. And now that Africa is reasserting control, American farmers are paying the price. If you zoom out and look at Africa's perspective, the decision makes perfect sense. African leaders know that food independence is power. When you rely on another country for your food, you are not truly independent. African farmers, especially small-scale poultry farmers, have been saying for decades that cheap U.S. chicken imports were destroying domestic production. Many of these farmers raise chickens in backyard or small rural farms. Their costs, feed, medicine, transportation, were too high to compete with frozen chicken dumped on the continent from huge American factories. As a result, domestic poultry production collapsed in many African countries, making them dangerously dependent on imported poultry. Governments began realizing that food insecurity was not just a problem, it was a national threat, so the bans and restrictions began. Some African nations cited avian flu as the official reason. Whenever outbreaks hit the U.S., African countries suspended imports, saying they were protecting consumers. While this reason is valid, it also served another purpose: protecting local farmers. Instead of relying on America, African countries turned to other international partners or increased domestic production. Countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, and others have been pushing aggressive poultry development programs. They're investing in local hatcheries, feed mills, veterinary services, and cold chain logistics. Some African governments have even introduced higher tariffs on poultry imports to encourage domestic production. This has created a new reality. Africa is no longer the easy export destination it used to be, and U.S. chicken farmers are feeling the consequences. A farmer in Georgia said recently that the biggest problem isn't that Africa is banning U.S. poultry, it's that America never prepared for what would happen if Africa stopped buying. For decades, the poultry industry expanded production, assuming export markets like Africa would absorb the overflow. When those markets shrink, the entire system is thrown off balance. Meanwhile, Africa is gradually becoming more self-sufficient. Some African countries are producing more chicken than at any time in their history. New farms are opening. Local farmer cooperatives are growing stronger. Government programs are offering subsidies to poultry farmers, something African farmers never enjoyed in the past. In contrast, American farmers are used to billions in government subsidies. Yet even with subsidies, the loss of African markets is creating financial strain. In some U.S. farming states, poultry is a major employer, and a sudden drop in exports means layoffs, reduced production, and falling revenue. The emotional impact on American farmers is real. Some say they can't compete globally without Africa. Others say that the U.S. should have done more to maintain strong trade partnerships with African nations instead of taking them for granted. For many years, the U.S. assumed Africa had no alternatives. But Africa did find alternatives. Some turned to Brazil, others to Europe, many even turned to local production. This has become a geopolitical story wrapped inside an agricultural crisis. And if you listen to the conversations happening inside U.S. farming communities right now, you will hear fear. Fear that Africa is the first market to collapse, but not the last. Fear that global buyers are diversifying and turning away from America. Fear that the poultry industry is entering a long-term decline. Back in Africa, the mood is very different. African farmers see this shift as empowerment, as justice, as finally breaking free from dependency. Many African poultry farmers say this is the first time in decades they feel hope. Instead of being crushed by cheap imports, they are being given space to grow. Instead of competing with giant U.S. agribusiness companies, they can finally supply their own communities with locally raised chicken. African governments are also realizing that stronger domestic agriculture reduces food inflation, strengthens rural economies, and creates jobs. By limiting cheap U.S. poultry imports, they are forcing the continent to build its own agricultural resilience. Africa banning U.S. chicken isn't just about chicken. It's about dignity. It's about food sovereignty. It's about refusing to be flooded with low-price leftovers from a foreign country that built its wealth on subsidized farming. It's about telling America we want to grow our own food and protect our own farmers. And this, more than anything, is what frustrates Washington. Because for the first time, African governments are openly choosing local farmers over U.S. farmers. They are choosing empowerment over dependency. And they are choosing a long-term agricultural vision over short-term cheap imports. This shift is exposing a deeper truth. The U.S. can no longer assume automatic influence over African markets. Other players like Brazil, Russia, and China are also stepping into the poultry market and offering Africa better deals. America is losing influence because it failed to adapt, failed to invest, and failed to see Africa as an equal partner. Now the consequences are falling heavily on American farmers. In the years ahead, U.S. farmers may face even more challenges. As Africa continues to grow its agricultural sector, demand for foreign poultry will keep shrinking. American chicken farms, once operating at full capacity, may need to reduce production, shift strategies, or find new markets. Some may even shut down entirely. Economists warn that the decline of African poultry imports is only the beginning of a broader trend. Developing countries are building their own food industries, and the U.S. can no longer rely on them to absorb excess products. African farmers, on the other hand, are finally receiving the attention and support they've been demanding for decades. Governments are incentivizing local production, improving farming technologies, and promoting domestic consumption. As Africa grows, its population expected to reach 1.7 billion by 2030, the demand for food will skyrocket, and African governments do not want to depend on foreign imports to feed their people. They want African farmers to supply African markets. The story here is bigger than chicken. It's a story about global power shifting, a story about African agriculture rising while U.S. agriculture faces new uncertainty. A story about how a continent once seen as a dependent market is now becoming a global agricultural competitor. A story about how U.S. farmers, who once felt untouchable, are now facing one of the biggest market losses in decades. As more African countries tighten restrictions on U.S. poultry, tensions will rise. Lobbyists in Washington will push for trade negotiations. American farmers will demand support. African policymakers will continue prioritizing domestic agriculture, and the global poultry market will reshape itself. The United States never expected Africa to stand up, never expected African farmers to fight back, never expected African governments to take bold steps to protect their agriculture. But that is exactly what is happening. The era of one-sided agricultural dominance is ending. The era of African agricultural independence is beginning, and American chicken farmers are experiencing the painful consequences of a continent that has decided to take control of its own food future. As this story unfolds, one thing becomes painfully clear. The global food system is changing, and nothing about this shift is accidental. The struggle of American chicken farmers is not merely the result of Africa banning more U.S. poultry imports. It is the result of decades of assumptions, overlooked warnings, and a belief that certain markets would always remain open simply because they had been open before. But today, Africa is no longer playing by the old rules. The continent is no longer accepting its role as an endless consumer of foreign agricultural leftovers. Instead, it is rising, recalculating, and reclaiming control over its own food future. And for the first time, America is being forced to confront the consequences. What is happening right now is more than a trade dispute. It is a statement. A quiet but powerful declaration that African countries are prioritizing their farmers, their food security, and their economic independence above the interests of foreign agribusiness giants. For years, African farmers watched as their poultry industries collapsed while cheap U.S. imports dominated the market. They watched their own governments depend on imported chicken while local barns sat empty. They watched youth abandon farming because it felt impossible to compete with subsidized American products that arrived already cheaper than anything they could produce. But now that era is fading, and with every restriction, every ban, and every policy change, Africa is saying we want to feed ourselves. In the United States, the tone is very different. American farmers are anxious, frustrated, and increasingly vocal about the crisis they see unfolding. They know Africa's decisions have real consequences. When African countries shut the door, it's not just a lost market, it's a direct hit to the livelihoods of farmers, truck drivers, factory workers, hatchery operators, and entire rural communities built around poultry production. For many of these farmers, Africa wasn't just another trade partner. It was a lifeline, a place where the unwanted parts of American poultry found consistent demand. A market that provided financial safety in an industry with tight margins and unpredictable domestic prices. Losing that stability feels like losing a guarantee they thought they could count on forever. And yet, while American farmers feel blindsided, African countries insist that this shift was long overdue. They argue that relying on foreign food imports is unsustainable, especially in a world facing climate shocks, supply chain disruptions, and rising global prices. They argue that they cannot build strong rural economies if they continue drowning under a wave of cheap foreign meat. They argue that protecting local farmers is not protectionism, it is survival. And when you look closely, their position is not only understandable but unavoidable. Any nation that wants long-term stability must prioritize food sovereignty. Africa is simply doing what every developed nation has done for centuries, protecting its farmers, its economy, and its future. The tension between American farmers and African policymakers will not disappear anytime soon. If anything, this is the beginning of a much bigger shift. As Africa strengthens its agricultural infrastructure and boosts local production, American farmers may continue to lose ground. Africa's growing population means rising food demand, but this demand may increasingly be met by Africans themselves, not by cheap imports from the United States. And as African nations become more confident in their policies, they will continue to use trade restrictions strategically, balancing the needs of local farmers with the realities of global competition. But the real story here is not about loss, it's about transition. It's about a global marketplace that is no longer one-sided. It's about Africa stepping into a new era of agricultural ambition. And it's about the United States learning that even the most powerful economies cannot take foreign markets for granted forever. The world is changing. Markets are maturing. Countries once considered passive importers are becoming active producers. And the balance of economic power is shifting in ways that would have been unthinkable just 20 years ago. For American farmers, this moment is an alarm bell, a warning that they must adapt, innovate, and rethink their strategies. For African farmers, it is a moment of hope, a long-awaited opportunity to rebuild what was lost. And for the rest of the world, it is a reminder that agriculture is not just business. It is politics, survival, identity, and independence. The fight over chicken imports may seem like a simple trade issue, but beneath it lies something much deeper: the right of nations to shape their own destiny. And as this story continues to unfold, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Africa is no longer waiting for permission. Africa is no longer accepting a role assigned by others. Africa is choosing its own path, and whether the world likes it or not, that path leads toward power, self-reliance, and a future where African farmers stand on their own feet, feeding their own people, building their own industries, and rewriting the rules of global agriculture.